Hey everyone, how's it going? This is Azren, the language nerd here, owner of the Calgary Language Nerds, and welcome to today's podcast episode and, of course, YouTube video. Today I'm doing a language learning AMA. AMA means Ask Me Anything. I posted on my Facebook saying that I was going to do a language learning AMA on my podcast, and I received a variety of different questions that people wanted me to answer. And so today there are 4 questions that I'm going to answer. They come from Rhonda, Peter, James, and Stephen. Okay, let's just go in order here. Let's start with Rhonda's question. Rhonda asks, why do we think we're going to learn a language much faster than we actually do? So I'm not sure if anyone can relate to this. I definitely can. Whenever I start to learn a language, in my mind, I always think to myself that I'm going to learn much faster than I actually do. For example, when I went to India for 2 months back in 2018, I believe it was, I thought to myself that I would be there for 2 months, do intensive Gujarati studies, come back from my trip, and have something resembling, I was thinking, a B2 level in Gujarati. Now, I improved a lot while I was in India, but I did not reach a B2 level. I had a similar experience when I went to Peru. When I went to Peru, this was many, many years ago now. When I went to Peru, I had a very similar thought process. I thought to myself, if I go there for a couple of months, I'm going to magically become fluent. Or even sometimes when I started to learn other languages in general, I would always think my progress was going to be faster than it actually was. Now, why does this happen? Well, there's a number of reasons why it can happen. One reason I think has to do with something I learned at my previous line of work. Many of you probably know I used to run a window cleaning franchise. And at that franchise, we learned about something called the transition curve. The transition curve basically describes the emotional roller coaster that we ride when we're learning a challenging new skill. Now, here's how this emotional roller coaster works for, I think, everybody. We start at uninformed optimism. This means that when you start learning a new skill, you're very optimistic because you're uninformed about how much work is required or how difficult it's going to be. You then hit crisis of engagement. Now, crisis of engagement means something like this. You started to learn the language. It was really fun in the initial couple of weeks, and then you hit some grammar point, or you bump into a word you can't pronounce. You stumble across something in the language that's hard. And no matter how much effort you're putting in to try to figure it out, you can't. And then you get frustrated, and you hit what's called crisis of engagement. This means you realize, oh, this might be more complicated than I thought. This might be more difficult than I thought. You then move to the third stage, which is the informed pessimism stage. Informed pessimism means you start to get a little bit pessimistic because you're more informed about what it's going to take to learn the language or whatever skill in question. You then go further down the process and you hit what's called crisis of meaning. Now, crisis of meaning is a fight or flight moment. It's when you hit rock bottom. And this is a point where people either quit or they keep pushing forward. One of the two things happens. When people quit, when people don't quit, one of the biggest things that will help people not to quit is support from other people. The harder the skill, the harder the thing that you're trying to learn, the skill you're trying to learn, the more support you're probably going to need. And also, the harder the skill you're trying to learn, most likely, the harder you're going to ride this transition curve. Your ups and downs are going to be much bigger. Okay? Now, if you make it past crisis of meaning, you get to the final stage, which is hopeful realism. Or actually second last stage, hopeful realism. Hopeful realism means you realize all is not lost. You realize, oh, I can do this. Oh, maybe I can do this. There is indeed hope. And the final stage is informed optimism. Now you're informed that it's not as bad as you thought. You can do this. And so you're informed and you're optimistic because of that information. And then the cycle restarts. You might ride this transition curve multiple times when you're trying to learn any new skill. So to answer Rhonda's question, why do we think we're going to learn faster than we do? It's probably because we are at uninformed optimism when we first start to learn a language. We're uninformed, and therefore we are optimistic. Moving on to question number 2. This one comes from Peter. Peter asks, how many times do you need to be exposed to a word before you start using it in conversation? Good question. Well, Peter, I think there are a number of factors, and I'd like to talk specifically about 3 factors. So one factor is the frequency of you needing to use the word. Very few people I've ever met, if anyone, frequently forgets how to say hello or goodbye in their target language. They pick that word up pretty fast because you use it all the time. You're always saying hi, you're always saying goodbye. And so maybe you struggle with it for a couple of weeks or something, but immediately that word becomes automatic. In fact, going on a tangent, people also often ask me, hey, how do I think in my target language? How do I think in it? I can't think in my target language. I find myself translating. And one thing I always tell them is, you probably are translating, but I think you're not translating for everything. For example, the word hello, you're not translating for that. That word probably just pops out of your mouth. You don't need to think, how do I say hello in Spanish? Oh, hola, right. No, that word is just automatic. So that's become automatic. And there are certain things, even when you can't think in a language, there are certain things that you automatically say in the target language that you don't say, that you don't have to translate in your head. That's a topic for another day, but I wanted to throw that tangent in because it is relevant and related. So the frequency of you needing the word is going to be one significant factor. If it's a word you need a lot, you're probably going to remember it a heck of a lot faster than if it's something you don't need to use very often. The next one is the circumstance of your exposure. The circumstance of the exposure. What does this mean? Well, this means how were you exposed to the word in question? I'll give you an example. When I was in Taipei, this was back in 2019. When I was in Taipei, it might have been the first or maybe the second day I was there. I was walking on the street with the homestay family that I was living with. They were showing me around the neighborhood, and we were walking along this road, and we were about to go, I believe it was on a scooter or perhaps a motorbike. I can't remember which one it was. And I don't remember if we're going to climb on it or if I was just passing by one. I also can't remember that. What I do remember vividly was the homestay family telling me, whoa, Azren, be careful, it's really hot. I didn't know that word for hot. I knew the word 热 for hot. 热 is Mandarin. Is Mandarin for hot. But they used another word, which was 烫. And I was like, what does that mean? I didn't know what it meant. And I said, what does that mean? And they said, you know, when something's hot, you touch it and it's like, ooh, 很烫. And I was like, oh. And they were pointing at the, I believe it was exhaust pipe on the motorbike, because those can get pretty hot. And I think they were afraid I was about to touch it with my leg or something. And so something about how I was exposed to that word made it stick instantly. I probably only heard that word that one time before I remembered it, and I could even use it myself. It stuck in my brain almost instantly. But there have been countless other words where I hear them, and it takes me forever to finally be able to use them myself. Could be because of the context of how I learned it. Could be that they were low frequency words to start with. So that's a second factor. Our third factor is the complexity of the word. Something reasonably simple, such as the color black or the color, white, like my hoodie here, or brown, or something like big, small, a person. These are all very simple concepts to understand. They're not very abstract. But maybe something like, I can give you, again, a Mandarin example, or sure, let's do a Mandarin example. In Mandarin, there's a grammatical form that does not exist in English whatsoever. In fact, there are a couple of grammatical forms like that. And the words required to use those grammatical forms would not really stick in my brain. And I also couldn't form those sentences very well. So the complexity of the word will also be a factor. So I don't know how many times you need to be exposed to a word, but I guess what I will say is understand that lower frequency words will take longer to remember because you don't use them all the time, nor do you hear them all the time. The circumstances surrounding how you learn the word are going to be important to consider, because if you learned it in a very memorable way, you're going to need less exposure to it to be able to use it. And lastly, the complexity of the word is also going to be a major factor as to how many times you need to be exposed to it before finally you're able to use it yourself without really having to think too much about it. Those are 3 big factors. I'm sure there are others. Let me know in the YouTube comments. Let me know on Facebook or Instagram, any social media platform I'm on. Feel free to let me know if there's other factors that you think I've missed, because I think there probably are a lot of factors. We can make a whole podcast about that question. Question number 3 comes from James. Are some dialects harder to learn than others? Now, James gave some examples as, learning different dialects of Spanish, maybe from Spain or Mexico or Argentina, or different dialects of French, such as Quebec or France, for instance. Are some dialects inherently more difficult than others? Well, I'm going to answer this the following way. I think that yes, certain dialects are harder, but not for the reasons that you might think. So I think the biggest factor is how many resources are there for that specific dialect. Like if you're trying to learn French, for example, there are far more resources that use a European style of French, where the accent is more like from France, the vocabulary is more from France. There are, at least that I've come across, far more seem to be from there than they would be a French-Canadian French or Canadian French. And so if you wanted to learn a Canadian French, not to say that there aren't resources, but at least what I've seen, it seems like the vast majority, or at least, let's say the vast majority of resources I've come across seem to be a more European variant, France variant of French. And so the number of resources available is definitely a factor that could influence how difficult or easy a dialect is. Another one would be the ease of you being able to interact with that dialect. Now, it could be interact in real life, as in you talk to people that have that accent or that dialect of a language, or could even just be on the internet. Maybe even on the internet, for some reason, there aren't that many people who make videos or content or such using that particular dialect of the language. That's also a thing. It can be a factor as well. So if you can't really get exposed to it, that might make it harder, right? And that ties into what I was saying with the number of resources. Often those will go hand in hand. Often, not always, but often. Right, and then we have some individual factors, some things that might be specific to you. So for instance, maybe you just find a certain dialect easier to pronounce, or a certain dialect easier to understand. Maybe for you, for some reason, who the heck knows why, but for some reason, you think it's easier to understand people from Spain than from Mexico. I don't know, maybe you just do, just right from the get-go. Or maybe it's not even understanding or pronouncing the sounds. Maybe it's something like the people you click with. Maybe when someone's from one country that speaks a certain variant of the language, their culture is a little bit different, and you just click with those people. You get along with them very well. You feel warm and fuzzy about it. Whereas another dialect, you don't click with the personality of those people, at least the people you've met from that particular region. So all of a sudden, that factor is also going to make one dialect easier than the other, one variant easier than the other. So I guess what I'm trying to say is, yes, some dialects might be harder to learn than others, but I don't think I struggle to say in every case, but in most cases, at least in many cases, it's not going to be because one dialect is inherently harder than the other. It's more for other factors that have nothing to do with the inherent difficulty of the dialect. It's more individual factors, right? Last one here, number 4. This one comes from Stephen. Now, this is a fascinating question. This one, I really like this question a lot. So people say, I'm reading Stephen's question here, I've paraphrased a bit. People say that the goal of becoming fluent is to be able to communicate about a wide variety of topics. But there are certain topics in my first language that maybe I can't talk about very much. He gave examples of different car terms, like he doesn't know what an alternator is. He doesn't exactly know what the clutch might be. There are various car-specific terms, for example, that he doesn't know. So his question is, should we tailor the second language studies around what we already know in our first language, or should we use the target language to learn more about the world? Great question. So again, I'm going to answer this in a few different ways. I think there's multiple different answers, and my hope is that my little rant on this topic gives you the answer, or gives you an insight that you didn't have before. Here's how I view it. So first of all, I am someone very recently too, actually, this has been a theme in my life, and versus or. And versus or thinking has been a theme in my life. What does this mean? Well, often I find myself defaulting between thinking that when I have a choice, I have to pick one or the other. But more often than not, when I've been faced with choices and I ask myself, could I do both? More often than not, I'm able to do both. Frequently, I can do both in the same day when I thought maybe I couldn't. Frequently, it meant that, okay, I can do one today, one tomorrow. But almost always when I have a variety of choices, I would often default into thinking, okay, which one should I do? Which one should I do? Right? I have to pick and choose and prioritize. But frequently, I've now found that if I think, okay, I have these 7 things I want to do, let me put and, not should I do this one or this one or this one or this one or this one. It should be, I'm going to do this one and this one and this one and this one and this one. And as I said, more often than not, I found that it's possible. It's just that I didn't ask myself the question if it would be possible. So one answer to your question is, don't think, should I tailor my studies around what I already know, or should I use the target language to learn more about the world, learn about topics I don't know? Do both. You definitely can do both. So maybe you focus on learning about topics that you talk about in your day-to-day life because that's important to you, and you go learn about topics that you don't really know about even in English. You can definitely do both. Nothing wrong with that. Another way you could focus on this, another way you can answer this question or view this question is you could just pick a priority. You could literally pick a priority based on your personality, based on your learning preferences, based on what interests you more. So you could decide, you know what, for me, I'm going to focus on learning the language that I would use even in English. You know, I teach yoga classes. I'm going to learn how to talk about yoga in Japanese. I don't know, I run a business. Well, I want to be able to do all the day-to-day business activities I do in English. I want to be able to do it in Mandarin or Japanese or whatever language. You could focus like that. Or you could say, listen, this is a fun opportunity, a unique opportunity for me to go learn about something I don't know anything about and grow as a human being. And let me use the target language to do that. Let me go sign up for a class online about maybe mechanics or something. You find a mechanics basic car repair course that's taught online, and you take it in Spanish instead of English. And all of a sudden you're learning all these words in Spanish, and all of a sudden you don't even know those words in English. God, there are words I know in other languages that I didn't learn in English for years. Even very day-to-day things. I'll give you a quick example. I previously wasn't a big tea drinker. I only really drank like masala chai, if you know what that is. Okay. That's all I really drank tea-wise. But then I was in Peru. That's probably even in France as well, but Peru is a good example that comes to mind right now. When I was in Peru, they would always offer me tea. After the family I was living with would offer me tea after a meal. And they were like, what kind of tea do you want? And they said, do you want this one, this one? And they said this word, which was manzanilla. Now, all the tea options they gave me, I didn't know what they were. But manzanilla sounded like manzana to me. Manzana means apple. And I thought to myself, well, at least I know what an apple is. Maybe it's like a fruit tea. And I started to drink that tea every day. I didn't know what it was. I didn't know the word in English. But I knew I liked manzanilla. I liked this tea. And I came back to Canada without even knowing what it was. And I don't know if I didn't know how to spell it, or I just didn't know how to find out what the English word was. And it took me a number of years before it literally took me years to figure out what that word was in English. And it was, of course, chamomile tea or chamomile tea, however you're supposed to say that word. So again, you could focus on learning stuff. You could focus on exploring the world, learning about more things you don't know about in the target language. That's also an option. The last way you can answer this question is don't overthink it. That's an option as well. Don't overthink it. If your learning path takes you in a direction where you're learning things that you would never have actually learned in your first language, go with the flow, right? That's also an option. So again, let's kind of sum up this final answer. You could do both. Learn things that you don't know or you wouldn't learn in your first language, and learn things that you want to be able to talk about in your first language. Do both. You could focus on one or the other. You could focus on learning things that you would use in your target language, or you can just pick one, using the language to explore the world, learn about things you don't even know much about in your first language. Or you can just kind of go with the flow and learn the language in such a way and go where the wind takes you, I suppose. So those are the 4 questions I wanted to answer today. I hope you guys liked that podcast episode. Feel free to send me any other questions you want me to answer. I'm always happy to answer questions on YouTube and my podcast and such. You guys know where to reach me, at Polyglot Azren on any social media platform. That's POLYGLOT AZ or ZREN. Have a wonderful rest of your day, and we'll chat soon. Bye-bye.